This is the second webinar for the British Society of Criminology's Green Criminology Research Network. So second webinar of the year, something like the 14th webinar. I forget what the actual number is. So I'm delighted to present for you today, as it were, or introduce to you today, Dr. Martin Crook from the University of the West of England, who is going to talk on the subject of a political economy of eco-genocide. And I see on his first slide, Martin is subtly plugging his book, so I don't have to. So Martin's going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. So if you've got a question, either put it in the chat, or when we get to the Q&A, I'll get you to raise your hands. And I will keep an eye on the people joining the room and make sure that people are muted. So over to you, Martin.
Lovely. Thank you for that introduction, Angus. So yes, basically today I'm going to be doing a kind of, it's largely based on the book where I try to pull together some of the theoretical and empirical threads that I've been developing over a number of years of my earlier work to try and construct what I call a political economy of genocide, or in this particular instance, eco-genocide, which is to say, more broadly, to try and inject genocide studies with some kind of sociological and criminological rigor. So the outline, broadly speaking, will be first introducing some of the kind of threshold concepts, master concepts, which I think important, foundational concepts important to understand my project. So, which is to say, firstly, a Lemkin sort of understanding of genocide, a more sociologically rich definition of genocide, then moving on to what I mean by ecologically induced genocide, which is a term I've coined, but essentially it's looking at how ecological destruction can be a driver of genocide. Then moving on to look at the rudiments, the basics of what I mean by a political economy of eco-genocide. Shifting then to look at the case study in more detail. So my book does a comparative analysis of Kenya and Australia as sites of settler colonization, but we'll be focusing predominantly on Australia today, just because of limits of time. Focusing on, towards the end, the current period today. And in particular, one of the case studies that I look at in the book, which is the case of the Gomeroi Nation in New South Wales in Australia, and the impact of what I've called the extractocracy or the minocracy. So hopefully the environmental and ecological themes will become clear. So just very broadly speaking, very quickly, I'm not using a definition of genocide which equates it simply with mass murder or a legalistic understanding of genocide. Instead, as following in the footsteps of Lemkin, which inspired a kind of colonial or structural genocide school that I loosely identify with, as he argued, it should not necessarily signify mass killings, although of course it can mean that. It usually means a coordinated plan aimed at the destruction of the essential foundations of the life of groups. In other words, it's not an assault on individuals per se, but an assault on the structures and the essential foundations of the group itself. Claudia Card, the philosopher, she built on that, borrowing from Engels, actually, the notion of social death, and argued that genocide, the unique crime of genocide, is that it menaces the social vitality of the group, secured through intergenerational and contemporary relationships that form group identity, and gives meaning to life. In other words, social death. And as Lemkin argued, this end of social death, so destroying what the genocide scholar Martin Shaw calls the social power of a group, can be accomplished by the forced disintegration of political and social institutions, of the culture of the people, of their language, their national feelings, and their religion. So this is why I think we should understand genocide in sociological terms as a relational or structural phenomena. So hopefully that will become clearer as we move through the presentation. What I mean by ecologically induced genocide, sometimes I refer to it as the ecocide genocide nexus, is where ecological destruction can lead to genocide via the conduit of culture, given the territorially bounded nature of indigenous groups, and I would argue most groups or groups per se, which is to say, if you assume that the essential foundations of a group understood in sociological terms, whether it's the economic, the cultural, linguistic, legal, etc., is largely rooted in a particular territory, of course, if you destroy that land ecologically or sever the connection of the group from that land, that will bring about social death. So I won't go through every definition I use in the book. I'll just use the pithy one. I define ecologically induced genocide as the destruction of or severance from the ecosystemic habitat of the group. So building on this sort of sociological understanding of genocide, which will prefigure my political economy of genocide, it's important to draw your attention to the fact that in the last couple of decades or so, the genocide studies field has incorporated the insights of settler colonial studies. So when I talk about the political economy of genocide, I'm largely talking about case studies which involve settler colonial societies, where genocide takes place in peacetime, not wartime, although war can often be an extension of the same logic. A forthcoming piece that me and my colleagues are writing about Gaza will make that case. And so it's largely in peacetime, and where the social structures of that society and its economy are inherently genocidal. And the insights of settler colonial studies did a lot to help us understand the logics, the prevailing structural logics of settler colonial societies in that respect. So Lemkin defined genocide as essentially colonial. He argued it's a two-stage process. He said first it's the destruction of the social and cultural life of indigenous populations, followed by the second stage, their replacement with what he termed the colonizers' national pattern. Now, the indigenous peoples themselves can be allowed to remain, but as a viable social entity, they are replaced. So the essence of the structure of settler colonial societies, as Patrick Wolf, the godfather of settler colonial studies, argued, are predicated on this dual process that Lemkin defined. In order to do what? To seize land and, of course, resources. This is essentially the driving, the structural imperative of settler colonial societies. Critically distinguished from franchise colonialism or extractive colonialism by its land-centered logic of elimination. That's the term that famously Wolf coined. And settler colonial societies are not historical. They are not a done deal. They are ongoing, permanent systems which systematically eliminate indigenous peoples through various techniques, not just physical destruction or mass murder, but various techniques and modalities, such as mass killings, biocultural assimilation, spatial technologies as well, segregation, concentration, etc. And this central structural imperative to seize land and resources, we can identify the social forces that constitute what the historian Tony Barter described as relations of genocide. And this term really did basically trigger my academic career in many ways. It inspired my whole PhD and my later work. You can obviously see the debt he owes to Marx. It's obviously it's a phrase based on Marx's categories. So, as Patrick Wolf argued, we are obliged to try and identify and trace those various modalities of the logic of elimination, which I would translate as essentially genocidal. The various modalities, the various discourses that are used, the various ideological formations, institutional formations. So he argued in a seminal paper called Settler Colonialism and the Elimination of the Native that, quote, genocidal outcomes have not manifested evenly across time and space. In other words, relations of genocide have a history. They mutate and evolve over time. Now, my contention is that those mutations, those evolutions, those changes, those phases of genocide can be attributed to the changing structure and imperatives of the settler colonial economy and society, right? And that's hopefully what I'm going to build on and persuade you of. This is coupled, of course, with symbolic dimensions like discourses, biopolitics, forms of governmentality, and what I termed in the book, and based sort of inspired by the Marxist Lefebvre, racial spatialization. But we won't have time to go into those symbolic dimensions today. Now, to break down the model further, I argue in my work that a political economy of eco-genocide, which largely exists in settler colonial or post-colonial societies, having two stages. So in essence, there are two structures of the political economy of genocide. These two structures are manifested by capitalist ecology. So something about the capitalism or the capitalist structure or capitalist mode of production, its relationship to the environment, which gives rise to these two structures, which are eco-genocidal. The first structure is primary accumulation, sometimes translated as primitive accumulation from Das Kapital. This involves alienating social groups from their land through processes like enclosure to secure de facto control of the land and the resources. Of course, this happened in Europe over many centuries, giving rise to the working class, an essential prerequisite of the industrialization process. But it also took place, of course, in settler colonial societies like Australia, United States, Canada, New Zealand, and elsewhere. That's the first structure. And this structure is this of primary accumulation is manifested in repeated attempts to sever indigenous peoples from their land through a variety of land grab schemes, both by private actors and state actors. Now, the second structure is once this is successful, assuming it's successful, the primitive accumulation, the land grab, is the second structure takes hold, which is the operation of the value form, what Marxists call the value form. So once indigenous land is fully incorporated into the circuits of production and capital accumulation, then the logic of commodity production takes over, and the value form, which Marxists argue blindside capitalism to the environment and nature's contribution to production, takes hold, and so production takes place without taking heed of nature's limits. Okay, it transgresses nature's limits. This involves, this second structure, of course, the erection of various institutional frameworks and legal property regimes, as well as labor regimes, land regimes, population policies, and so on, which I document extensively in the book. Okay, so a short note on the second structure, just to flesh out again some of my theoretical contentions here. So drawing on Marxist ecology, the second structure, the operation of the law of value, is important to sort of clarify it a little bit. So, of course, the profit motive, as Marxists argue, demands exploitation of humans, but it also demands exploitation of nature in the form of using up natural resources, commodifying or commercializing quote-unquote exotic environments like indigenous land. And the logic and structural dynamics of capitalism can be boiled down to the imperative to expand. And there are a number of implications where genocide is concerned. First of all, expansion of objects and services, which are transformed from objects of need, use values, into exchange values. So commodities produced purely for exchange. We're talking here about ever-increasing commodification of nature, like logging, mining, cattle ranching. As I explore in my book, in the case of Kenya, today it also includes, perversely, the privatization of the atmosphere as an ostensible effort to tackle climate change. And of course, expansion into quote unquote non-capitalist territories, which invariably means indigenous land. This once it's taken place, leads to the transgression of nature's limits because of the metabolic rift, which is, in essence, as a concept I've borrowed from Marxist ecology, the disruption of natural cycles, like the carbon cycle or the nutrient cycle, where nature can't generate as fast as humans can extract. Marx, of course, famously talked about this in the context of the soil erosion crisis with the second agricultural revolution in 19th century Europe. But I talk about it in my book, both in terms of the history of the Australian settler colony. So I do a kind of, I guess you could call it a historical sociology, but also today in terms of the degradation of forest and indigenous lands because of the impact of forms of what we call extreme energy, like coal seam gas, sometimes referred to as fracking in the UK, which took place on Gomeroi and Githable land. So the relations of genocide. I think I'm just going to build another sort of theoretical building block here, which is to say that I argue that in the case of settler colonial societies, there is a dialectical interaction between the ecocidal logic of capital on the one hand and the settler colonial logic of elimination on the other. Often they go hand in hand, sometimes they don't, which is to say there are occasions, which I document in my book, where indigenous forms of life, indigenous modes of production are preserved in mutated, distorted form on colonial terms, so that indigenous labor can be more effectively exploited, assuming they're deemed useful, for instance, for the pastoral economy. And to the extent that indigenous labor is deemed useful, then relations of genocide will be attenuated to some extent. Sometimes, in many large swathes of Australia, that wasn't the case. The logic of capital was simply predicated on land. Therefore, indigenous peoples were deemed fiscally barren, so they were entirely eliminated and destroyed. And so relations of genocide were not attenuated. In those cases where they are attenuated, where there is a tension between the logic of capital and logic of elimination, we see a kind of dialectic which is mediated through forcible conjoining or articulation of two modes of production. Of course, the colonial capitalist mode of production and the indigenous mode. Because, of course, as Marx argued in Capital, the history of capitalism rarely, if at all, ever exists in pure unadulterated form. It's always in some kind of relationship with other modes of production. He, of course, famously makes that argument in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, where he shows there are multiple coexisting modes of production in 19th century France. So I'm borrowing from him in that regard as well. Hartwig, I believe he's a South African Marxist, developed this argument in the context of South African apartheid, where he argued there were articulations of two modes of production. And he argued that the articulation of two modes does not revolve exclusively around the extraction of surplus labor, but it can include the following three things: extraction of commodities in different ways. That can include fossil fuels, subsurface minerals, even factors of production like land, which is what we'll see in the case of Australia, in my case study. Sometimes it's not the product that is extracted, but it is indeed labor power, also something I document in the case of Australia. And in those two instances, political policy will be founded on or turn on the domination, but also the conservation of non-capitalist societies to some degree, as I said, on colonial terms. In other instances, the particular mode of economic exploitation is accompanied by policies that basically completely destroy, annihilate non-capitalist societies. And they are, in that case, the producers are freed, quote unquote, from the means of production. And we see here the total disappearance of non or pre-capitalist modes of production, or what I would call genocide. Let's see where we are for time. So I probably will skip this and maybe leave this for questions and answers, this section, in the interest of time, but I borrow from Marx's theory of formal and real subsumption of labor to develop this argument. But essentially, it's a very useful way of further increasing the resolution at which we can understand this relationship between the articulation of two modes of production. So in the book, I basically create phases. I kind of create a sort of a history of different phases of relations of genocide in the manner in which Patrick Wolfe asked us to do. And so I argued that for the first roughly 100 years, up until the end of the 19th century, we see open frontier violence in Australia, open direct physical confrontation, where violence is the principal genocidal technique to pacify indigenous peoples and suppress Aboriginal sovereignty in order to secure land. This was driven by, again, as I say, there's a political economic element, thirst for wool. Thirst for wool at the heart of the empire, which was driving a land grab, pushing colonists from 1788 onwards, right across the continent eastward. It was, as one historian, Russell, described it in the early 19th and even up to the early 20th century, driven by sheep and cattle, which were the shock troops of empire. This constituted the development of a trajectory of Australian settler capital and its various, of course, class agents, the wool growers, what is called described in the literature as the squattocracy. And this, as historians have argued, should be seen as a global process anchored in the British Empire, because of course the wool fed the textile mills in the UK. Just as the cotton from the plantations, slave plantations in America did as well. So this basically constituted a kind of a world imperial division of labor, where the Australian colonies were consolidated as various regions, which were forcibly incorporated into a global process of primitive or primary accumulation. Now, in the second phase, from the 20th century onwards, you see a turn towards different relations of genocide, kind of what I call protection or welfare regimes, where the colonial authorities resort increasingly to institutional or bureaucratic measures to extinguish indigenous sovereignty through biological or cultural absorption. Sometimes that meant segregation and concentration, other times it meant forcible integration. And then to jump fast forward to today, we see what I call the recognition phase from about the late 1980s onwards. What is that? Well, we see basically the rise of indigenous civil and land rights movements, the struggle for self-determination being recognized in various key court decisions like the Mabo court decision in 1992 and legislation like the Native Title Act. Unfortunately, these forms of rights and recognitions were constructed in such a way that they basically extinguished any indigenous sovereignty and facilitated the continued colonization of indigenous land, largely driven by the mining lobby, who lobbied hard to force the government to remove, the Howard government, I think it was, to remove any rights to veto any development projects on indigenous land, especially mining. And this was, of course, and it's also this Native Title Act, which deprived the right of veto, also validated all existing commercial titles. But it's important to recognize, as I do in the book, that this sort of adaptation to a new phase of genocide, the recognition phase, was actually initially driven by indigenous resistance. This pushed the settler colonial system or regime onto the pushed relations of genocide onto the terrain of rights discourse. Now, I argue in the book that we can explain this shift not just by indigenous resistance, but the rise of the minocracy in the Australian economy, the growing thirst for fossil fuels from China. Australia has since become one of the biggest, if not the biggest, exporter of fossil fuels, especially gas, in the world. And this also dovetails with the rise of neoliberalism and a kind of unholy alliance between global corporate interests and the extractivist states. So various states in Australia restructured by foreign capital for the purpose of basically territorializing or capturing indigenous land for extractive purposes, especially, in the case of my case study, extreme energy. So what is extreme energy? What is coal seam gas? How is it? Why is it considered genocidal? Or why do I argue it is? So this is just one example, and I document a number of examples in the sections on Australia in the book. But in one case, an oil and gas company called Santos were still planning, and this has been going on and on for many, many years, to extract coal seam gas from forests and farmland in and around Narrabri, which in northern New South Wales. Now, this land is recognized as native title land for the indigenous group known as the Gomeroi. Okay. Now, what this process involves, this extraction of coal seam gas, is essentially drilling wells and then pumping water to the surface which is known as dewatering, to lower the hydrostatic pressure, which then allows the release of methane that was adsorbed on the coal particles, on the coal seams. And they have to resort to hundreds and hundreds of well pads. It essentially entails the industrialization of the landscape, because the gas is not concentrated in large pockets. It often invariably leads to toxic water contamination as methane leaks into various water aquifers. It leads to the depletion of the water table, disrupting the ability of farmers to farm, which also a group that I interview extensively in the book. It leads to saline wastewater, which is also toxic, which then gases off and comes down as acid rain, having devastating consequences on local ecosystems and sometimes killing people. And it leads to air pollution, fugitive methane emissions that release from cracks in the surface of the land, and also the desecration and destruction of sacred and significant Aboriginal cultural sites, which have to be prepared to make way for these drilling pads. And if you read my book, it's evident that from the various field interviews, and I did in excess of 30 or so interviews with different groups, that the Githabul and the Gomeroi, they experienced this as the denial of their they experience the denial of their land rights through something known as Indigenous Land Use Agreements, which I'll come back to in a second, via this legislation I referred to earlier, the native title system, which denies them the right to veto, as well as the ecologically destructive nature of extreme energy. They experience this together as a genocidal threat, as an existential threat to their very way of life. Now, the ILIAs, just to explain, under the legislation, the NTA legislation, essentially gives Indigenous peoples the right to negotiate with gas companies and development companies for 6 months, but they have no veto, as I say. And at the end of the 6 months, those gas companies or other corporations can basically oblige what's known as the Native Title Tribunal to facilitate access to the land regardless. So it produces what one of my colleagues, Professor Damien Short, calls a colonial dilemma. Either Indigenous peoples resist, and so they resist and basically they're swept aside anyway, or they accept in order to get some royalties and then see the destruction of their land, which then leads to the destruction of their sacred and cultural sites and brings about potentially social death. Here are some examples. Here's the Santos CSG project in the Pilliga Forest, also in New South Wales. You can see some of the well pads here. This is another project in Queensland. It's a slightly bigger pan, so you can see just how many wells there are and how it industrializes the landscape. So I'll finish with this. I basically argue that we can further deepen our understanding of the logic of extreme energy like coal seam gas by applying or using Marxist theories of value. So there are a number of ecological implications that can be accounted for if we use some of the categories of Marxist ecology. So first of all, the value-nature contradiction. So that is to say that by primarily focusing on commodity production for exchange, as I said earlier, the capitalist mode of production is blindsided to nature's contribution to the production of wealth. It's rendered invisible by the formal abstraction of abstract social labor time, the sort of blinkered focus on exchange value. This formal abstraction under exchange value tends towards the simplification and homogenization of nature, as well as its kind of artificial divisibility or fragmentation. So just think of how these the hundreds and hundreds of fracking pads or drill sites extract the gas in a way that doesn't pay heed to the knock-on effects on the fragile balance of ecosystems. That's the artificial divisibility and fragmentation. It drives what green criminologists describe as crimes of subtraction, so ecological withdrawals, of course, that's the extraction of the gas, and crimes of addition, so the saline toxic water, the gassing off of methane and the acid rain and so on. And so I argue that CSG in Australia is an example of this, of artificial division and fragmentation of local ecosystems with no regard for the anti-ecological effects that this unnatural throughput and transfer of energies and materials has on the local environment, and of course, critically on the local population, including indigenous peoples. I also argue that we can actually explain the resort to extreme energy, like coal seam gas, or as I've argued with my colleague in another paper on the tar sands in Canada and northern Alberta, we can explain the resort to these forms of extreme energy, again, by using a kind of political economic analysis. So in Marx's book in Capital, he talked about something called materials supplies disturbances. What this means is that eventually the insatiable accumulation of capital, the never-ending expansion of production, leads to the exhaustion of supplies and materials. This has a knock-on effect. Through the operation of the law of value, the price of the relevant raw material, in this case oil or gas, will go up as the amount of socially necessary labor time objectified in each individual product rises in relative terms. In other words, as we reach peak oil and we're running out of fossil fuels and gas, the amount of labor time that goes in relative to that ever shrinking total quantity of oil and gas increases. This leads to a rise in the cost of the scarce resource, fossil fuels. Then that leads to a competitive resort to what Marx called previously unused substitutes. Now, he was talking about crisis in agriculture, but we're here, of course, we can apply it, I think, quite neatly to understanding the resort to extreme energy. And so extreme energy is both an expression of those material supply shortages and an accumulation crises, and also a competitive response to that material supply shortage. Value analysis also explains another irrational feature of extreme energy, which is the energy return on investment. So the energy return on investment profile for something like tar sands or fracking or CSG is terrible. The amount of energy you get back for the amount of energy you invest is a ratio of something like 2 to 1, 3 to 1, whereas in the past, in the halcyon days of oil extraction in the early 20th century, it was 60, 70 barrels of oil for every 1 barrel used to extract it. That doesn't matter if the price of oil or gas keeps going up and up and up, given what I just described earlier, the material supply disturbances. So to conclude, we have considered what we mean by ecologically induced genocide. We've made some tentative theoretical observations about the political economy of ecogenocide. I've tried to show how the relations of genocide or phases of ecogenocide are conditioned by the changing structure and imperatives of the settler colonial economy and society, and how a political economy of genocide invariably underpins settler and post-colonial societies. And it consists of those two structures, or those two phases that I talked about. And also how we can employ a Marxist value analysis to account for the rise of extreme energy and the source of value. A neoliberal conservation project. Sorry, that's a spoiler for the other half of the book, which focuses on Kenya. So I think I'll stop it there. Thank you.
Excellent presentation, Martin, and
Thank you.
thanks for keeping to time. Okay, let me just stop the recording and then I will throw it open